Welcome to the first What's Up in Ottoman and Turkish Studies monthly meetings. I hope everybody is having a wonderful Wednesday. I will be admitting everybody as they come in, and I will start with a very brief introduction to give you a little history of our prize that's the prize winner of which, Erik Blackthorne-O'Barr, today will be presenting. It is in the spirit of us starting to celebrate our 50th anniversary next year. So if you just give me a few minutes only, it will take very short and then we'll get on right away. So where does this prize start from? Where did it get first started? Sidney Fisher Graduate Student Paper Prize. Our organization goes back to 1971. And what happened in the 80s, late 80s, they started thinking about prizes. And right in 1989 it was, and if you read the minutes of the meeting, general members meeting held in 1989, you will read that it was moved, seconded, and passed that $40 be added to the Institute of Turkish Studies grant of $160 to make a $200 prize for the best graduate paper. So unfortunately, we are still given $200. We do not recognize inflation at OTSA, but we want to, and it is partially related to you. Please, please, please, if you are not a paying member, consider becoming a paying member so that we can have more membership dues and maybe adjust our prices from the level of the 89, that'd be wonderful. In 1989, the very first year when it was awarded to Jeffrey Bale from University of California in Berkeley. And the paper was the ultra-nationalist right in Turkey and the attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II. It's kind of a contemporary type of research paper, very different from the one that we will hear today. In 1990, it was the Student Paper Prize, and the recipient was our dear colleague, Jane Hathaway. Jane Hathaway has given so much to this association in very different roles, including president. And in her paper, The Role of the Kızlar Ağası in 17th, 18th century Ottoman Egypt, gives us a clue about her future work on Egypt, and even her most recent book on the chief eunuch of the Ottoman court. And then if you are wondering where Sidney Nettleton Fisher name came from, he was one of the early historians of the Ottoman Empire in the country. He received a degree in economics from Oberlin College in 1928. Then went to Turkey, worked at Robert College as a instructor, as a professor of mathematics, and then came back, got an MA in history, had a job at Denison University, got a PhD from University of Illinois, and he worked with Leibeyer, writing a dissertation on the foreign relations of Turkey, 1481 to 1512. And then took a position at Ohio State in 1937 and worked there until 72 when he retired. He was replaced by our dear colleague, former President Carter Finley, who recently retired and was replaced by someone who also got one of our awards, this very award in 2006, Yiğit Akın. Other people whom I could locate in various records who received this graduate student paper prize in the past are on this screen. I promise sometime next year, you will see a full list at some point in our website so that you can see over the years who received the award. And if, as much as I can, I will also try to put the prize committee members. We do have records. It's just a matter of putting them in organization and putting them all together. But here are on this screen, you can see several people whom you might know. What I put in parentheses are where they are working right now rather than where they were at the time that they received the prize. So for today, I would like to also acknowledge the members of the committee that selected this year's prize. I'm not quite sure whether they are here. If they are here, they could just say hi by saying, raising their voice. If not, I will just read the names. The chair was Jeanette Okur from University of Texas at Austin. And
Hi, I'm here.
oh, thank you, Jeanette. Thank you so much for your work. Jeanette Okur works on Turkish and also cultural studies on modern Turkey. Then there was Jim Ryan from NYU. Jim is here. Yeah, and Kimberly from Buffalo State. She works on anthropology. And Jim works on early modern Turkish Republic opposition in that era. And Oscar, are you here by any chance? Oscar Aguirre Mandujano is at UPenn. He works on early modern Ottoman history, intellectual history. As you can see, we try to balance the selection committee with people following things on language literature, with people working on older history, newer history, and social scientists. And last but not least is I would like to introduce today's chair, Virginia Aksan. She is actually the inspiration where the name came from. She had written in the inaugural issue of the last cycle of our journal of Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association, an article called What's Up in Ottoman Studies. And I thought that was a very good and warm way of talking about what is going on. So she, as you all know, was a president of our association. She was a president of Middle East Studies Association. She published many books, tons of articles, and recently we tried to honor her as much as we possibly could with a book that was edited by Frank Castiglioni, Ethan Menchinger, and Veysel Şimşek. Our colleague Aslıhan Gürgüzel at McGill organized this year's annual Great Lakes Ottomanist Workshop. And the workshop's kickoff meeting is this very Friday. And that this kickoff meeting is a roundtable on this very book, Ottoman War and Peace, State of the Art. So it's on Friday from 12 noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can find the link on McGill's Islamic Studies page. Now I am going to turn the mic to Jeannie. Jeannie, please go ahead.
Thank you, Baki. Welcome, everybody. I see we're up to 42 participants. That's really quite marvelous. And I'm very proud to be part of this, Baki's initiative to bring the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association ideas, research, prizes to this burgeoning public. So I'm very happy to be here. I get we have a commentator, that is Elizabeth Frierson, is sitting next to me. I mean, she's in the next window. Raise your hand. And she will follow Erik, who is going to give the paper and with comments, and then we will hope to have some time for questions. Erik, will you, I'll introduce you. We think maybe if you can manage 20 minutes, and then let Lily have a few minutes, and then we open it to questions. And Baki has muted you all. He perhaps didn't say that for the moment, but we will. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce Erik Blackthorne-O'Barr, who is currently a PhD student at Columbia, but started in Toronto, where this is where I first met him, and has also a master's in Sabanja and finished up an MA thesis at Columbia in continuing his PhD. His paper today, the prize winner, is called Journals of the Plague Year, the Ottoman Press and the Istanbul Cholera Outbreak of 1871. Over to you. You get to unmute him.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me just share the screen here. Okay, can everybody see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, let me just move this over here, and there we go. So, hello everyone. Before I start, I would like to thank you all for being here. The Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association and Professor Tezcan for launching this seminar, inviting me to speak. And of course, thanks to Professors Aksan and Frierson for their kind introduction and for their generous engagement with my paper. Today I'm going to talk about the 1871 outbreak of cholera in Istanbul, a period spanning about 4 months, which provoked a brief panic throughout the city before the disease disappeared as quickly as it arrived. The entire incident was afterwards largely forgotten, including in the historiography of the late Ottoman period. In this paper, I focus primarily on how the outbreak was depicted in the Istanbulite media of the time, and how the sense of imminent disaster revealed the hidden tensions present in the notions of a unitary and ideal urban public, and in the universalizing fictions of public health. Obviously, this is a very topical issue. I began to write the paper in early February for a seminar on the colonial city taught by Professor Zeynep Çelik. And I was at first trying to think through Istanbul as a place which was not formally colonized, but where colonial sanitary institutions, which were largely accustomed to operating elsewhere through force or hegemonic power, instead had to rhetorically appeal to international norms and, quote, the general good. As I was writing, however, and this pandemic spread, the resonances with our contemporary moment gradually unfolded and became clearer and clearer. Indeed, perhaps even the very same patterns of denial, projection, fantasy, and recrimination. On one hand, there was a certain comfort in this repetition and in the way that what had appeared at the time to be a looming catastrophe came in retrospect to be seen as such a non-event as to be of little historical or popular interest. Yet there was also something deeply disconcerting in how quickly this moment, which had seemed poised to rupture the truths held evident by those who claimed to speak for the public, dissipated, and its disruptive potential was lost. As I write in my conclusion, historians tend to like turning points, to find a moment or a period when one system gave way to another. Yet the study of historiographic non-events reminds us that entrenchment is always as much a possibility as transformation, and that this too has historical value. Let me switch the slide here. There we go. In what follows, I examine the reportage of 4 newspapers which circulated during the outbreak, each of which spoke to a generalized public, albeit through very different methods. 3 of these papers, the English language Levant Herald, the French language La Turquie, and the Ottoman Turkish Basiret, were dailies with circulations in the thousands and covered a wide range of world news and local events. Each newspaper interpolated a different linguistic and social constituency and had a different formal relationship to the Ottoman state. The Beyoğlu-based Levant Herald was widely considered an arm of the British Embassy, whereas the Fatih-based Basiret largely took a pro-Ottoman government line. These papers all likewise claim to represent public opinion in different ways. The Levant Herald, through the frequent publication of anonymous or semi-anonymous readers' letters, the Turkey, by asserting itself as an unbiased and objective reporter of events, and Basiret, through the publication of Şehir Mektupları, or city letters, in which the paper's editor and chief correspondent Ali Efendi invited his readers to follow along on his embodied journeys through the streets and comment, usually critically, on the daily experiences of the metropolis. The 4th paper, the French language Gazette Médicale d'Orient, was by contrast the press organ of the city's emergent sanitary establishment, which had grown in stature following a large outbreak of cholera in Istanbul in 1865 and the commencement of the 3rd International Sanitary Conference in the city the following year. Indeed, the Ottoman Empire was not a passive subject of the 19th century sanitary order, but an active participant in its formation and maintenance. The Ottomans skillfully navigated between those countries, led by Britain, which argued that cholera was essentially an endemic disease caused by unhealthy environments, and the French-backed camp, which held that cholera was contagious and could be stemmed by a global regime of quarantines around so-called Fortress Europe. Istanbul was, strictly speaking, neither the metropole of an unquestionably sovereign state, nor was it, as Matthew Gandhi writes, relegated to the marginal status of a colonial city in the production of bacteriological discourse. Instead, Istanbul was an immensely productive site of scientific debate and ideological conflict, in part because the actions of each institution in the city had to contend with the interests of others in a constant struggle for legitimacy and political relevance. The outbreak offered an opportunity for actors like the Levant Herald to establish their anti-contagiousness credibility, And for the Ottoman state, which in July of 1871 had promulgated a comprehensive new health regulation, it allowed it to demonstrate its institutional competence. Both aims, however, would be frustrated by the rapid and anticlimactic course of the disease. So, indeed, it was the Levant Herald that first raised the alarm. The paper, founded in 1857, was the city's primary English-language newspaper, and as early as July, it had been tracking rumors of cholera spreading throughout Anatolia. Over the course of several weeks, the paper published several remarkable articles, correctly arguing that cholera was transmissible through contaminated water. This was in direct contravention of the stated policy of the British government, which argued that the disease was endemic and caused by poverty and lack of personal hygiene. On September 4th, the day that the first 2 cases of cholera were reported to have appeared in Arnavutköy, a suburb of Istanbul, the paper revealed who had instigated the publication of these unusual pieces: Dr. Edward Dixon, the chief physician at the British consulate in Istanbul. Dixon was remarkable among the British medical establishment abroad for his strong belief in the correctness of the work of John Snow and microbial theory. The researcher Sheldon Watts has gone so far as to say that he should be regarded as a British national hero. And it is clear that he had attempted to use his position to spread these views among the reading public before the cholera outbreak began in earnest. Within days, however, the paper would turn against Dixon, declaring his beliefs a case of official absurdity and warning that he could face charges of false imprisonment for advocating for the imposition of quarantines. On September 7th, the French language La Turquie published a full translation of the articles Dixon had forwarded to the Levant Herald. Founded in 1866 as a successor publication to the long-running and highly popular daily Journal de Constantinople, La Turquie prided itself on its ability to, quote, not express any opinion on controversial topics, and to correct the factual mistakes of other publications. In practice, this editorial stance meant being generally supportive of the actions of the Istanbul medical establishment and the Ottoman state, including offering tentative endorsements of the quarantine measures attacked by the Levant Herald. It was on September 14th, however, that the relative equanimity that had characterized the response to the outbreak finally broke. With 14 cases now suspected in the city, the Galata Board of Health voted to deny the presence of the disease, and instead blamed the symptoms on an endemic and non-transmissible cholerine. Doing so would allow the port to continue to issue clean bills of health and prevent the interruption of trade between Istanbul and the rest of the Mediterranean. Even these measures, however, drew the intense scorn of the Levant Herald, which argued both that cholera was present in the city and that attention to personal hygiene and not quarantine was the only cure. La Turquie took the opposite view, arguing that the Board of Health was right to deny the existence of epidemic cholera in the city and that all deaths up to that point had been due to, quote, carelessness. Soon after, Basiret too began to report on the outbreak. In a city letter from September 22nd, Ali Effendi described his decision, quote, out of curiosity, to ascertain the degree of truthfulness of the rumors. Like La Turquie, Basiret aligned itself with the efforts of the Sanitary Board. Unlike the supposed objective remove of the French language paper, however, Basiretçi Ali Effendi directly brought the readers along with his investigations and implicated them in his moral judgments. In this case, the paper's moral judgment was directed not against the state, but against the victims of the illness, whom, Basiret argued, had blamed the government for their own lack of personal control. Ali Effendi argued that those who had fallen ill had eaten spoiled food, with a, quote, sinful gluttony totally contrary to all norms of health, and had consequently fallen ill. Although acknowledging the occurrence of some deaths, Ali Effendi wrote that these were almost certainly caused by, quote, hemorrhoidal diarrhea and not cholera, and that, in any case, in its current state, our country is totally safe from such a dangerous and terrifying illness. During the last days of September, the papers recounted various incidents around the city that spoke to a populace on edge: sudden deaths at popular cafes, or the, quote, ghastly scandal of a naked corpse seen on today's Istiklal Caddesi. On September 28th, La Turquie argued that it was time to put an end to this abnormal situation and resolve the question of the presence of cholera in the city, which keeps it in a state of alarm. 2 days later, the authorities did so, declaring that cholera had officially arrived in the city, they imposed quarantine on the hard-hit neighborhoods of Kasımpaşa and Ainul and poured lime into the sewers and streams to stem the flow of the contagion. The outbreak had begun in earnest. As the Gazette Médicale d'Orient wrote towards the end of the year, it was in early October that the city's medical establishment, which had denied the presence of the disease and had been riven by internal divisions, finally took control of the situation and began to seize the mantle of public responsibility from the press. Yet this claim would hardly be left unchallenged. The Levant Herald, of course, was dead set against the measures imposed by the health authorities. And even La Turquie now began to change its position. Where it had once claimed that the health committee was alone competent in these matters, it now wrote that, quote, the local authorities, since they could not prevent cholera from invading the capital, should not pretend to prescribe the districts it must visit. At the moment, then, that the sanitary establishment of the city had asserted its right to act on the public's behalf, the press, which had earlier been ideologically divided, united to criticize the measures taken as tyrannical oppressions of the public will. Rejecting quarantine, but also unable to formulate a coherent response as to what should be done, the Levant Herald turned towards publishing a variety of quack remedies suggested by the readership, spraying the ground with disinfecting acid, dispersing choleric gases by firing artillery through the streets, and drinking extremely potent mixtures of opium and alcohol. This is one of those stranger than fiction moments here, but by the 16th of the month, however, the disease had begun to heavily impact the British community in the Haskoy neighborhood, where several deaths among the British and Jewish inhabitants of the district. And it was at this point that the Levant Herald's inability to articulate a clear response to the outbreak had devastating consequences. Whereas the populations of Kasımpaşa and Ainul had, to some extent, followed the quarantine regulations, the British community of Haskoy instead turned to a rumored cure for the disease, the injection of ammonia underneath the skin. The disproportionate loss of life among the British residents was only further exacerbated by the paper's exhortations for the British community to break quarantine and protest, quote, against the absurd and vexatious sanitary arrangements, and to physically intimidate Ottoman officials, such as throwing stones at them when they arrived. When the officials capitulated to British demands, the paper promptly praised the minister's ready deference to suggestions made in the public interest. So the paper's public, which had before the outbreak, at least rhetorically, encompassed the entire city, had in the midst of crisis shrunk down to the particular interests of the British residents at Haskoy. Basirachi Ali Efendi was likewise in somewhat of a difficult position. He had committed himself to the argument that the disease was nothing more than mass hysteria, provoked by a few cases of indigestion and diarrhea. With the health board now declaring an official epidemic and imposing clear containment measures, his statements had put his credibility on the line. His response was to maintain that his initial position had been correct, whilst arguing that the actions of the health board were aggravating the panic. In a subsequent city letter, Ali Efendi argued that the outbreak in Ortaköy was, as he had said, due to the excessive consumption of spoiled fruit. He argued that another outbreak in Arnavutköy had been spread by, quote, oily fasulye, contaminated with verdigris, and a ship's crew that had eaten raw mussels fed on the rust of the bottom of a ship. Although acknowledging that the Kasımpaşa outbreak did not quite match the description, he claimed to have ascertained for sure that something close to this occurred. Istanbul, he argued, had been affected by a crisis of confidence, which the extreme measures of the health authorities had only exacerbated. Writing that, quote, there are no grounds to criticize whatever health officials do as such, he nevertheless lambasted, quote, the savage cure of quarantine, and claimed that this treatment was only spreading fear and excitement throughout Istanbul and probably in foreign countries as well. As the month closed, and with quarantine still in place, the Levant Herald upped the ante. Claiming that the crisis had revealed the impotence of the British embassy, it called for aid from the other diplomatic legations of the city, and threatened that if one of the diplomatic corps of these other embassies should fall prey to the sickness, they would, quote, have small claim to public sympathy if they did not accede to the paper's demands. It went so far as to propose that, quote, an embassy kavas or a second dragoman might be usefully sacrificed for the purpose of spurring the legations into action. Stripping bare the pretense of universal medical humanitarianism, the paper now argued that native lives were expendable for the preservation of the British colony in Haskoy. It would not be until November 13th, however, that the quarantine around the district would be lifted, and the disease, apparently of its own accord, gradually began to disappear throughout the city. The Levant Herald proclaimed that, quote, "The sanitary authorities have acceded at last to the voice of public opinion and lifted the useless and vexatious cordon." Yet with the end of quarantine, the Levant Herald was forced to account for why the English population of the city had been hit so hard by the outbreak. Denying any responsibility, the paper instead argued that, quote, "All the deaths from choleric causes which have happened during the present visitation of the epidemic have been amongst the very lowest and poorest classes of the population, with the exception of the English of Haskoy, who had been infected by Ottoman governmental incompetence." Unable to explain the incidence of cholera according to ethnic or racial types, the Levant Herald thus turned to class. The following month, the Levant Herald ran a series of long articles from December 5th to 14th, proclaiming its own vindication and arguing that the high death rate among the English community of the city had in fact proved that quarantine was ineffective and tyrannical in practice. "All humanity shudders," it wrote, "to think of the deprivations of the quarantine system." Thus, those advocates of quarantine among the European and Ottoman health establishments were thus excluded from membership in this global public. By contrast, the paper argued, Great Britain enjoyed, quote, "all but complete immunity from the disease," excepting, it wrote, "sporadic outbreaks in Irish dens and the lowest, dirtiest, and most squalid districts." The undramatic end of the outbreak also led Basiret to proclaim itself vindicated. As Ali Effendi argued in a city letter from November 26, founded upon rumors, there was no such sickness in Istanbul as everyone imagined. The whole incident, he wrote, had been in large part a media exaggeration of the normal level of endemic death in a metropolitan city. He wrote, "In such a large city, percentage-wise, every day surely victims and patients must proliferate." The quick resolution of the outbreak was, for Ali Effendi, a mark of the quality and attentiveness of Ottoman governance, and the fortunate result of far-sighted municipal reforms. Ultimately, however, it was La Turkey that, in its trademark fashion, gave its, quote, "objective opinion" on the quarantine debate. In its December 14th issue, it posed a question to the public. Is cholera such a terrible disease? Many of our doctors strongly claim that this disease is not contagious, although others claim no less highly that it is, and superlatively so. So who to believe? The answer, it wrote, lay not in rhetoric or ideology, not in press reports or government proclamations, but in deeds and actions. As it concluded, who to believe? No doubt those who are from the contagionist school, for those who seem to deny the quality of contagiousness to cholera, prove by their prudent conduct with regard to the sick, that in their heart of hearts they believe in it themselves. The last month of the outbreak was marked by further recriminations and entrenchments among the city's press and medical establishment. Ultimately, the 1871 outbreak produced no real structural changes. Despite being hard hit by the disease, the Anglophone community of the city continued to be told that cholera was endemic to the insanitary practices of the lowest classes, the Irish and the Orientals. Despite gradually coming to realize that contaminated water was the medium of cholera, the Francophone press instead began to espouse that it was the consumption of brackish water, rather than the spread of contaminated sewage, that caused the disease. And the quick end of the outbreak simply confirmed the theories of the Turkish press that it was largely a media creation, a product of stoked mass hysteria, rather than a real disease. The retrospectives of the Gazette Médicale d'Orient were riven by those who held that quarantine was pointless in the, quote, immense swamp of filth called Asia, and others, like Edward Dixon, who felt that it had confirmed microbial theory. When the next large outbreak of the disease occurred in India in 1881, his faith in quarantine led him to blow the whistle on the failure of the British government to institute proper inspections and health measures, almost resulting in his dismissal from service. Nevertheless, there is great historical value in the study of such non-transformative moments. Long obscure in the historiography of the city, the 1871 cholera outbreak in fact offers the researcher an intriguing portal into the notions which shaped social-cultural life in late Ottoman Istanbul, and the hidden divisions within the universalizing discourses of public health and sanitary science. The epidemiological Orientalism described by Nükhet Varlık, who's here, in her work, was brought into clear focus by the outbreak of disease in Istanbul, and by the reactions of the European identifying residents of the city to health measures put in place by the Ottoman state. However, the 1871 outbreak also showed the power and the limits of claiming to speak publicly, whether on behalf of the urban public or with the authority of global public health. The Levant Herald, which had claimed to speak for all humanity, was revealed to have little more than the narrow ideological interests of the British colony in the city at heart. The city of Basidachialiev in these letters, likewise, was revealed to have a kind of symbolic border in the middle of the Golden Horn. The public of the city's public health establishment was contested. Was it the European residents of the city or the citizens under Ottoman jurisdiction? The rich of Beyoğlu or the poor of Kasımpaşa and Haskoy? The Ottoman Empire or Fortress Europe? The 1871 outbreak had all the markings of a transformative event in which these contestations would be brought out into the open, until it ended and earlier truths were reconfirmed. Yeah, that's what I got.
Sorry.
Authoring.
Right. Go ahead, Lily. I was just going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, that was terrific. I'm going to have very brief comments because çünkü sizlerden öğrenmek istiyorum. I don't want to say much because there are so many people here who have wonderful things to say. But for those who haven't seen the entire paper, this is a very rich compilation of many views. And he also brings in Georg Hermann von Mühlich, I think, the head of the German hospital. So this is a very skillfully presented intersection of urban history, all the wonderful developments in history of medicine. I'm glad you cited Neuquet's epidemiological Orientalism and intellectual history in terms of using the press. So what I hope we'll do today in our session is give Erik critique that will strengthen this article and challenge him to do more in the ways that he's going. And I had a whole set of questions I wanted to ask him, but that's when I thought we were meeting for 2 hours. So if we're meeting for 1 hour, I'm just going to say 3 things. One, since cholera is known for watery poop, to put it politely, or rice water poop, and Istanbul is a port city, I think you could do more with water in terms of, you know, maybe our intellectual, our literary people could use water and symbolism in this, could weave that in a little bit. And for me, you know, my first acquaintance with this was in studies of the Crimean War and the toll that cholera took in that war. I think you could, you know, I think that what you've done to give us an untransformative moment, you might want to refer back to the Crimean War and the institution of the hospital in Scutari, which was notorious in Florence Nightingale's time there for the reek from that hospital, partly from gangrene, but a lot of it from cholera excrescences. So the other thing is that I would love to see you do a bit more with the ethnicization of mortality rates that you mentioned in your presentation today. But that's about it. I would, and as Baki has noted, you can use the chat function to send questions as well. Again, sizlerden öğrenmek istiyorum. So I'm going to turn it over to the group.
Yes, I'm back. So have you, Baki, are you going to unmute or?
Everybody can unmute themselves right now. They should be able to without any problems. And I suggest that people raise their hands using the raise hand function, which you can find through the participants button, or you can just send a question using chat or a comment using chat.
But I do not see the hands on my participants list because you have everybody muted.
No. It's just that I don't think anybody raised his or anybody raised a hand yet. That's why.
Oh, yes, Renee did and Niket did both. I saw them, right?
No.
No, I just clapped.
Oh, you were.
The raise hand thing. The raise hand thing is in. If you go to participants and open it up down at the bottom left, there's a raise hand icon there for you.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But because you're a co-host, you don't see it. Only the participants have that option. But once they raise their hand, you'll see their hand.
All right.
Has her hand up.
Niket has her hand up.
Right.
All right.
Yes, I managed to raise my hand successfully. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm actually very much looking forward to reading the paper itself, and I'm sure I will have more questions and we'll hopefully talk more about this. But just for the time being, I am curious if you can say a little more about how this was seen as a non-event or event. What does it mean for an outbreak to become a historical event? How was it in conversation, or was not in conversation with past outbreaks? I mean, especially, the whole historical narrative is being constructed in the shadow of like 1865 outbreak, right? A major pandemic year. So I'm just curious. I mean, of course, this will have the tone of like at least second half of 19th century with this whole, contagianism, anti-contagianism debate, as you mentioned, and the bacteriological, framework. But at the same time, I am just curious about how you see the production of historical discourses or the narratives around like event making in the light of the memory of outbreaks, if you see, or maybe not.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, the 1865 outbreak was, I think one of those things that we probably can call an event, right? In the sense that not only is there a rich historiographic tradition describing this and talking about, what happened and its consequences, but, within popular memory, within, histories of the city that were, written shortly after, it held a very large sort of place within cultural memory. And the 1871 outbreak, at most you'll find a single sentence or like a short paragraph about it in any sort of narrative of cholera or even history of the city. And I think that's because, and then there's another outbreak in 1892 and 93, which is also a sort of big event because by this time we have much more established bacteriological theory, and so there's a lot of attempts to now utilize that theory and in controlling the disease. I think 1871 ends up being a non-event because it was a sort of stress test for these institutions that developed after 1865. And it appeared that the institutions had survived, right? They worked properly. The disease was contained, it was controlled. And so consequently, it just was not really something interesting to look at, right? Or interesting even to remember. Catherine Kudlik has a book about cholera in Paris, which is sort of similar, where she's talking about how during the first time that cholera struck Paris, this was like an apocalyptic sort of event. There was, social chaos. There was, people acting like it was the end of the world, pretty much. Whereas when subsequent outbreaks happened, it became much more and more normalized. And I think we could kind of imagine this in the case of coronavirus too, right? Like things that if you were told someone 2 years ago, oh, we have to wear masks outside, we can't meet in groups more than 10 people, you say, oh my God, that's apocalyptic. But we just kind of got used to it, right? And I think what happened is that there was not enough of a gap between the 1865 outbreak and this one for it to become something that was new, right? It was still something that was kind of at this point familiar, or it was becoming familiar. And in that sense, I guess it was sort of just, I don't want to say repressed, but, repressed in that kind of sense that it was not sort of worthy of interest. But I think when we look at the actual, reportage from the time, we see that there actually was a moment where this was a great panic, right? Before people knew that this was going to be a non-event, right? And so, yeah, I think that's, yeah.
Any other questions?
I can,
Jim is up.
I
All
can
right.
defer to Palmyra if she'd like. It's quite all right. In any case, Erik, it's really great to see you, and having read the paper on the committee, it's really great to hear this further contextualization and re-narration. One, I guess, question I had coming out of the paper, you've made this really artful choice to focus on 3 distinct communities through presses in their particular language. And we learn a lot by comparing and contrasting the different approaches each of these outlets take to covering the pandemic, to creating a sense of a public understanding of what the epidemic is and how to handle it. At the same time, these publics are asymmetrical, so, Basiret, right, when I'm driving here, is Basiret only speaks to a particular segment of the Ottoman public. And I was wondering as I was going through this, how Basiret's take on the epidemic contrasts or compares with other perspectives within the Ottoman press, and how much division or comedy even might exist in between different segments of the Ottoman language public, and if there's something that might change our perspective or our assessment of a non-event if we look, in a wider scale within the Ottoman press.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I chose Basiret because it was both very different in format from the Levant Herald and La Turki, but also unlike, Takvim and Vekai, it's not an official paper, right? It has some kind of relationship with the state, but it's not directly sort of, just giving kind of events, right? That from the government perspective. And there's other, Turkish language papers at the time. There's Diyojen, which is the comedy sort of satire paper, right? In 1871, the scope of the Turkish press is still fairly small. It really expands in the 1870s. But in 1871, there's still, I think in total, there's 14 publications in Istanbul at that time. So in that sense, I do think it is representative of a certain viewpoint, which is not quite the government viewpoint, but it's also not really an opposition viewpoint. And I think, the sort of particulars of Basiret do come from the way in which the Ottoman Turkish reading public is different from the English or French one, right? So, I mean, as we know, Ottoman Turkish newspapers were read aloud in coffee houses and were read aloud in kıraathanes and stuff. And I think when we think about the way that the reportage works in Basiret versus the Levant Herald, there is that sort of, the true value of its statements come from its relationship to oral culture. So, the Levant Herald will use an anonymous source. They'll say, highly placed figure, or, this very well-regarded paradoctor or something. Whereas Basiret tells you the names of people. He tells you, I went there, I saw this, I asked these people, right? And I think, in a context where, the difference between news and gossip is sort of, still kind of fluid, him going out there saying, I saw this personally, and this is my own personal reflection of what I saw, has a much greater truth value, even if it's not objective in the way that the Turkey would want. It has a much greater truth value than the anonymous correspondence and the anonymous letters and all this stuff that the Levant Herald produces. And I think it also, when we imagine that it's being read aloud, having that kind of very personal element in the way that news is delivered, also, I think, I don't want to take it too far, but I think it does have a sort of connection to meta culture and to that kind of oral culture where you want to have that kind of personal touch to news. But I do think I should, because I did limit it specifically to, a very short period of time. So I think when if I take this further, I think I would look at, is there a retrospective in 1872 or something, right? And see how that developed.
Just a quick note, it might also be worth checking in with your colleagues who read the Armenian and other language presses in the city, so that you can bring them in to voice as in ways that we're able to do now. So I think that would be fantastic if you could do that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Definitely, I would love to do that.
Other questions?
So thank you. Really fascinating to think about this. I tried to encourage my students to log on, partly because I thought they would be interested in the tie-in with today, and thank you for reflecting on that. So you've done an interesting job of kind of casting back to this mega event that proceeds in 1865, and I had wanted to ask you whether the experience of that is, can you sense the experience of that very present in people's consciousness when they arrive at this one? So they arrive with a kind of basket of expectations about what's going to happen that either does or doesn't characterize the way they respond. So that was one question. But then I wanted to sort of open this out in two other ways. One is to compare the way people become inured to what we would think of as a potentially catastrophic situation and in the reporting of news. And one comparative framework is war. So if you look at the way people respond to a wartime situation as they're living through it, you know, the first round is a mega event and an enormous crisis and shakes everyone out of, you know, whatever their routines are. But if it continues, then people form new routines and they live in it or with it. And then if it ceases but comes back, their response to it is also different depending on how much time has gone by. Is it a totally new generation of people, or is it the same generation just 10 years later? And so I wondered if you had a sense of that playing into it. And then the other thing that I wanted to know is, and this also comes out of a contemporary experience about reading newspapers. You know, it's very often the case that something extraordinary, either bad or good, happens, and it's on the front page of the newspaper and even above the fold. But if something else happens within that news, within the next news cycle, it knocks it off the front page and sometimes knocks it way inside. And it never comes back again, or it does come back, but it comes back much smaller. So I think it would be very interesting to set the stage by telling us, you know, what are the other major events that are filling up the newspapers at this point? I think it would be exciting to know how this fits with that, and what is this story, how is this story competing for people's attentions? Because you do have an extremely varied population and they're responding in different ways. So I wonder if there are other things happening that have an impact on the way they're paying attention to that.
Yeah, for sure. I'll start with the last question first. Yeah, I mean, so almost as soon as the epidemic or the outbreak is over, you know, almost all the newspapers find other kind of cause celebs to start working on, right? So the Herald starts working on police corruption, the Turkey starts working on like road paving reforms and stuff. And one of the criticisms that Basudet made of the Levant Herald was that there were other news items, and the Levant Herald was deliberately exaggerating events in order to sell more advertisements. And they noted that the amount of advertisements sold in the paper during the supposed crisis, you know, doubled or tripled during that time. So there was a sense from Basudet, and to some extent the Turkey, that the Levant Herald was deliberately exaggerating the crisis and putting it on the front headlines in order to sell more advertisements. And there were also criticisms from the Turkey saying that, you know, there were unscrupulous doctors who were, you know, telling someone that they had cholera when they just had diarrhea or something, in order to, you know, get their name in the press and stuff like that. So because of that, I mean, that's another reason why I wanted to focus specifically on the press and not just on this kind of, you know, on the reality of the outbreak itself, because we know that the press reality is, you know, in large part, you know, the reality of this outbreak, right? It is not necessarily manufactured, but it is, you know, in large part feeding off of the press in some way. And in regards to the question with war, yeah, I think that's a really interesting parallel for sure. In terms of the way that, you know, what starts out of extraordinary becomes ordinary very quickly. And, I think it probably is the case that, again, because these two events were so close, the 1865 and the 1871, that, yeah, I think there was a kind of, maybe generational sort of familiarity with the disease that developed. But I think this is also kind of complicated in the case of cholera because, at this time, there's still a very fierce debate about whether cholera is even an epidemic disease, right? Whether it's just an endemic thing that people just have to live with, right? And, there's very powerful institutions which are claiming, no, this is just endemic. This is just it just lives in the soil. There's nothing you can do about it, except, have good personal hygiene. And so because of that, there is kind of a kind of strange cross purposes, because on one hand, the Levant Herald, for instance, was trying to deliberately, make this into a, very important press event. But at the same time, it's also claiming this is endemic and this is, not a contagious disease, right? And at the same time, people are denying the existence of the disease from the health authorities, but saying this is also epidemic and contagious. And if you get it, you're going to pass it on to someone. And so I think that was also very much contributing to the sense of panic and sense of confusion at the beginning, because in 1871, there's still a lot of people didn't know about this disease, right? In kind of historiography, we tend to say, okay, John Snow discovers this in water, Robert Koch discovers the actual bacteria, and, things progress, right? But there's still, first off, John Snow was not believed at first. And there's still 30 years in between those two events. And in that time, although these institutions are developed and are claiming a lot of authority to speak on behalf of public health, even within them, they don't really know or don't have a certain claim about how cholera actually functions. And so, I think that's why maybe we have such a panicked response at the beginning, and then this kind of sense of, well, it all worked out, so let's not talk about it afterwards. But, also, I mean, to come back to Professor Frierson's point about, the way that water and space sort of work, right? I mean, my partner, Sharon Mizvani, works on fountains and water culture in Istanbul and in Qajar, Iran. And, even though there was not really a definite link between water and cholera at this time, it does sort of, maybe, I don't want to say subconsciously, but it does, in a sort of broad sense, sort of change people's relationship to their environment and to space. Just because whether you believe this disease exists in water or in soil or in the air, choleric gases, as they said, the presence of this disease really did call for some kind of change for people, right? Whether that was in terms of personal hygiene or in terms of whatever. And so you see, in terms of water culture, for instance, in 1865, you have the cholera, and gradually, cholera becomes the sort of reason why the fountain should be replaced by privatized water and things like this. And the reason why fountains begin to be sort of, abandoned, or the systems begin to decay, is because even though they don't really know yet exactly how cholera propagates, there's just a kind of general suspicion of whatever the old system was, because, it might be contaminated by some kind of disease. And so that's why, even these kind of municipal works, which don't really seem to have a kind of close relationship to cholera, like paving streets and, opening up, very close streets and making avenues and stuff, actually do have a very strong, bacteriological focus, even if it's kind of implicit, not explicit.
I have Alexander Schweig. Yes, you out there still?
I am. Let me show up. Hi. So first of all, really excellent presentation, great topic, especially in that you can show things with an outbreak that is relatively not that famous. So I would like to know more about the European influences. So you mentioned some foreign medical institutions in Istanbul at the time. So if you could go into that, great. I mean, I know the Institut Pasteur was there later, but I think this is too early, right? And related to that, I would like to know, you know, as much as we can know what the relationship to those institutions and to the question of cholera in general was among local medical professionals. And I mean, of various types, if we know more than just the sort of like modern doctors, you know, Mektebi Tıbbiye, graduates, and how they felt about the contagionism, you know, versus miasma. And one last just informational question that's also related. So you said it's, Gazette Médicale d'Orient, is that the thing, the French? How long did that publish and where is it available?
Yeah, well, it's available on, I think Google Books. So it's all digitized. You can look at it online. Let me find out when it started. I started quite early, I think. I think it's in the 18, let me see. Yeah, in terms of the institutions, yeah, I mean, so there's, you know, things like the sort of Superior Council of Health of the Ottoman Empire, this Imperial Society of Medicine. What do we call these? Like, on one hand, they are largely dominated by, or they get their sort of institutional backing from, you know, European sanitary institutions. But I'm not sure if we should really think of them as necessarily European institutions of themselves. I think they're institutions which embody a certain kind of certain sort of colonial regime of medicine, but in Istanbul, they're not really functioning as colonial institutions. And, you know, there's a sort of, you know, when Fanon talks about medicine in the colony, right, he says that there's an issue, fundamental issue of medicine in the colonial context, which is that medicine depends on a relationship of trust, but you can't actually have that trust in a colonial setting. Istanbul was not really like that in 1871, right? This is not a context that's been, you know, occupied or something, right? And so these institutions, they really have to function rhetorically. They have to function as partners with the Ottoman government, but also with European governments and with, you know, the global kind of sanitary order. So for example, we have, you know, when the Ottomans go to these sanitary conferences, you know, oftentimes are represented by European doctors, right? You know, but there's a kind of, there's a way we could look at this and say, okay, well, this is all just, you know, colonial, and this is all just, you know, this is all talking about the universal, it's just in bad faith. But when you look at actually their actions at these conferences, usually these European doctors, whether they're working for Iran or for the Ottoman case, did genuinely try to work in the interests of the Ottoman Empire and Iran. They weren't really acting in bad faith. And so, you know, things like the Imperial Society of Medicine were a mix of Ottoman, you know, Turkish, Greek, Armenian, and also Levantine doctors. But the differences weren't really on the basis of European or Ottoman so much as on the basis of ideological conflict. And, you know, so one of the ways that Orientalism functioned in this case was that it functioned as a kind of set of assumptions. So, you know, on one hand, it could be a European doctor like Dixon who says this is a contagious disease that is caused by, the British negligence in India. But, you can have Ottoman doctors who say, well, no, this is endemic to Asia because Asia has, unsanitary conditions and stuff, and it's in the soil in Asia. And I think that, one of the things that we have to do with accepting Orientalism and colonialism as discourses is to say that, the way that these were employed were not strictly on European or Ottoman lines. I do have where the Gazette Médicale started. Let me find it here.
We're going to be out of time shortly. Lily had a follow-up question.
1857, so pretty early.
Yeah, just picking up on what you've said about the people who were producing the Gazette Médicale d'Orient, is that I don't know if you've seen this yet, but they were actually, the Levantine Greek and Armenian were saying of Turks that the Turkish mind was not capable of doing modern medicine. And so this is why they kept the language in French, because they thought Ottoman Turkish was not up to it. But others may disagree with me, but I think the whole question of Ottoman medicine and what I'm working on, pharmacology, is a wonderful take on what James Galvin calls defensive developmentalism. The Ottoman Empire was investing in public health and medical education earlier than some European states and cities, and they were keeping up and innovating in their own ways, and in ways that led to the authors of the Gazette Médicale d'Orient being challenged with the formation of a specifically Muslim medical organization publishing in Ottoman Turkish. And this all strikes me as a really, I wish that I had taken Zeynep Hocamız's course on the colonial city. I'm sorry for massacring Turkish here, Tarzanca again. But that, was Istanbul really a colonial city, and in what ways was it? I think your paper shows the vitality of the Ottoman Turkish press and helps us understand why Cairo and Alexandria were more or less colonized and Istanbul was not. And for me, history of science and history of medicine are a case in point of successive defensive developmentalism. I don't know if you would agree or if others would agree. And if we're out of time, then I just want to thank Baki so much. Büyük bir hediye oldu. Yani Osmanlı, sorry, I've got one of my UC undergraduates, so I've got to stop speaking Turkish. But thank you so much. This was büyük, kocaman bir hediye oldu. It was a huge gift to all of us, and a wonderful way to refresh our brains after we missed MESA and we're struggling to get our undergraduates to the finish line. So this was wonderful. Thank you so much for organizing this. And thank you, Erik, for this. It's been a great honor to be part of this, as Ginny said. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed doing this, and thank you so much for all the comments and questions. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the next one.
So if we have to close it down, we can, but can people stay on, Baki, if there are further questions?
If they could, yes, if anybody wants to stay on, definitely they could. I just wanted to say, if you're interested in organizing a panel around a topic, please do get in touch with me. What we're planning to do in general is to feature our prize winners, to feature our special issues of OTSA on these WhatsApp panels in the future, discuss issues that are of concern to us as for our association. And I prefer to do things that are of interest to multiple people. So if you can think of a topic around which a few presentations could be put together, please feel free to get in touch with me. And great thanks go to Amy Singer, our president, and also Maureen Jackson, our secretary, both of whose terms are ending. Luckily, Amy is staying with us for another year. It was their leadership that really went through, created this committee for selections, did the papers prizes. So it is them we owe everything. Thank you for all for participating. And if you want to stay a little bit more, please do so. Yes.
I was going to follow up with Erik just on, and actually Lily's comment about and Nuket, because I know she's worked on it so much. This question of warfare. I mean, the Crimean War is really only 20 years off from 50 to 70. And there you have an incredible mixing and a circulation of ideas is going on that is not ethnic. A very, very different context. If you take, for example, the whole struggle for Kars, the fortress of Kars, and how that's recorded and how the doctors that are with go out there. I mean, people call it the great military tourism war because there were experts and academics coming from the entire world, largely the British colonial world, but also the French colonial world, and gathering at these places where the soldiers were dying more so than from for actual bullets. They were dying from cholera. So to extend what you're thinking about as an urban context and exactly how those folks then fit back into this picture, I think would make for a brilliant PhD. What are you working on?
I'm working on Ottoman and Iranian like cultural relations.
Cultural.
But part of that is on part of that is on the way that, you know, pandemics and epidemics were kind of located coming from Iran to the Ottoman Empire. So.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also wonderful.
And can I build on what you said, Jenny? That the arrival of troop ships, you know, the description of the medical ships, the hospital ships that were coming in, it was masses of men lying on the open deck, pouring out rice water excrement on each other. And so that spread the disease on the troop ships in really appalling ways. So again, port city and people bringing in.
Right. Anybody else want to chime in here?
I have a very pedagogical question. You mentioned the French paper was online on Google. Is the paper in English? Is that also online available, just easily readable? Because for undergraduate students who want to do research but don't know the languages, it would be wonderful to add another thing for them to look at. So is the English paper similarly available online?
Yeah, so the Levant Herald is on SALT research. They've digitized the whole thing. La Turquie is on SALT, and it's also on the Bibliothèque Nationale de France has a website where they've digitized all that stuff. Basira is still just Hacker Tariq's archive, which is kind of difficult to use sometimes, but there is a way to use the files, so it's just kind of annoying because it's like an old file format. And then yeah, Gazette Médicale is on Google Books.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, you young people need to teach us how to use these digital resources. I still have not broken the Hakatarikus code, so yeah.
You know, I was struck by, I live in Hamilton, Ontario, for those of you who don't know that. It's on top of Niagara Falls. And Nuket's been here, she knows about Hamilton. Hamilton built pipes, had a water system and a water pump, pumping water out of the Lake Ontario by the turn of the century, 1880s, 90s. They'd get this huge pump that's still there and now a museum. And no less than 6 months ago, there was what we had that's called a sewer gate. When it was discovered that one of the overflow tanks, which they've had to build since then, of course, all over the city for overflow waters, had been leaking into our marshlands, and in terms of huge amounts of sewer gate and effluent. What'd you call it, Lily?
Excrement.
No, you had another word.
Excrescential. Excrescential. I don't know what I said.
There was a whole lot of wringing of hands that made it was a non-event. I mean, of course it was, the city was blamed for the various officials who hadn't crawled under and fixed the particular socket. But still, it is to say, because we also have a red zone. We have a territory that's called a red zone. And every time there's some kind of disaster like this, public health disaster, that comes up. And it's been coming up for over 150 years. It's the same place, the same people, the immigrants, it's the poorest, and they're the ones with the poorest health. And so my point really, if there is one, is to suggest the universality of this kind of topic and where you actually pull a halt to it. You seem interested in discourse, which is fine, but it strikes me that the press in another 4 or 5 years in Istanbul is going to be completely shut down under Abdulhamid. So what do we do with that in terms of trying to look at how those ideas are spreading among the public? That's where
Sorry, I have to disagree. It was not completely shut down under Abdulhamid. What we see is
censorship.
There was censorship, but it was managed by 3 different ministries and 1 separate council who were competing with each other and promoting. And the publishers became very skillful at navigating this censorship. So they'd shut down, they'd open up in another name. And so it wasn't until the Young Turks that there's a central office of censorship. So, yeah.
Good point.
I mean, there's I was kind of wondering, like, why don't I see like sort of readers' letters in the Ottoman Turkish press during this time? And it's because Ali Suavi's publication, Muhbir, had been shut down for a reader's letter, right? Just a few years earlier. So I think because of that, the Levant Herald was a little bit protected because of the embassy. But, I think they wanted to take as few risks as possible, even during Abdul Aziz's reign.
Anybody?
Okay, I was actually trying to unmute myself for last few minutes.
But, oh, sorry.
No, it's okay, but I just couldn't. But Baki, thank you for letting me. I just wanted to quickly add to the previous question that the proceedings of the International Century meetings, also they're all online because you mentioned for students, doing research, and great resource because you get to hear all the delegates, reports from different countries. So it's a good primary source in addition to, the other newspapers and such. So yeah, I just wanted to add that quickly.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nükhet. And I'm sorry why you couldn't unmute yourself. I'm not quite sure. I'm going to inquire about that thing with some IT people to make sure it won't happen again. All right. Any last comments or questions from anyone?
Yes. Yes. Unmute
Hello,
yourself.
everyone. Hello. It was great, Erik. Thanks so much for the paper. I wish I could read it very soon on OTSA. I was wondering, do you see any kind of connections? Because, the International Center Conference, was held in Istanbul, in Constantinople in 1866, before this time. So do you see any kind of implications of these, conferences or any kind of discussions about these conferences? And, you said, mostly European doctors actually went to these conferences, attended there. But as far as I know, in the late, something like 1898, as far as I know, the director of TÜBİTAK, actually, he himself directly attended this conference. As far as I remember, it was held in Madrid. So do you see any kind of discussions about these international congresses actually on this press particularly? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the conference is sort of major. I talk about non-events, but this is a major event, right? In terms of, setting up these sanitary institutions and really establishing them as authorities on public health. So for example, at the 1866 conference, the Ottoman delegation, I believe Saudi Effendi, who was the head of the health board, was one of the attendants there. So it wasn't just European doctors, there was Ottomans and Europeans. From the Iranian side, we also have both the European doctors and Mirza Malcolm Khan, who was like a very important politician. And, at the 1866 conference, actually sort of during this time, the sort of Asiatic powers, so that was Britain, Russia, Iran, and the Ottomans, sort of formed kind of a diplomatic bloc, because they didn't want to have this kind of global system of quarantines that could disrupt trade between Asia and Europe. what happens later on in the 1870s and 1880s is that the Ottoman Empire gradually sort of shifts towards the French model, partially because, you know, there's a very large influence of French doctors in the Ottoman Empire, but also because as a result of these negotiations, gradually the idea becomes that the Ottoman Empire should be the kind of border of the European quarantine system. It should be sort of included within it, or as a kind of transitory zone. What that does is, first off, it keeps Iran out of that zone, which is very sort of helpful for the protection of Ottoman power over Iran. But, you know, in a secondary sense, it was kind of a statement of Ottoman inclusion within a kind of European diplomatic and sanitary order. 1871 is still kind of, it's still in the middle of that process. So the Ottomans aren't fully in the kind of, you know, contagionist camp, but are still not fully, you know, believing that it's not contagious and that, you know, we should, you know, abandon the quarantine system like Britain is arguing for. So yeah, I think that's what I know.
Thank you. Nuket's hand is up, I think, right?
It is indeed.
Same problem.
Nuket, we heard you. We heard you.
Ah,
Thank you, yeah.
okay. Thank you. I don't know what's wrong. Maybe it's in my settings. It seems no one else does this problem. Anyway, just quickly wanted to mention to you, Erik, do you know Gülden Karayıldız and Sarı Yıldız and Oya Dağlar's article in the volume I edited on the island of Kamaran?
Yeah, the quarantine.
The quarantine station. I mean,
facility.
especially for kind of like, you know, I mean, you just like what you just last mentioned about like, you know, like 1870 where their position is still not clear, but, you know, by 1890s, you have a clear position in which the Ottoman Empire is kind of, you know, the safeguarding the entry. I mean, from the Hijaz, I mean, from the, you know, Red Sea and onwards, protecting the Mediterranean, and of course, after the Suez Canal and all that, that's kind of, you know, shifting the epidemiological frontier to basically the Hijaz and the Eastern Mediterranean, right? So that's, I think, a very important article, and I would recommend to kind of, you know, kind of refer to it, at least to what you just talk about. I don't know if you talk about this in the paper, like, you know, how to position this outbreak. But the other thing that I don't know if you know, Isakar Bolaños's work on Iraq, Ottoman Iraq. So more, not especially on cholera, but on more like environmental policies of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, but kind of, you know, offering us another frontier of that, you know, if you have that, you know, the Hijaz front on one side, but you have, you know, that area, especially, you know, Basra and all that, but like, you know, looking at like Iran and Ottoman Empire and kind of that dynamic and more in an environmental context. And his dissertation must be accessible. I don't know, he also has an article in IJMES. I recommend that very much as well.
Yeah, I saw him at Glow actually. So.
Okay, all right, great.
Yeah,
great.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you know, my broader project is working on Ottomans and Iran, and you know, yeah, I mean, we see, especially in Iraq, there's a very clear kind of, you know, argument that Iran is a kind of source of disease, and you know, whether it's from the corpses that are transferred over to be buried in Karbala or Najaf, you know, whether it's from cholera or the plague, or whether it's through these kind of quarantine stations, which end up from the Ottoman side actually kind of surrounding Iran, right? Because there's an Ottoman station at Hormuz, there's an Ottoman station. And, you know, one of my, you know, general arguments is that the way in which Iran gets discussed in epidemiological terms gradually comes to be also reflected in cultural terms eventually. And, you know, we also see this like with people in Midhat Pasha's government in Baghdad relate to Iran in this kind of way as well. And those people, bureaucrats, end up filtering throughout the Ottoman state. So, you know, that's kind of my general focus at the moment. But yeah, I mean, this paper I think is, was kind of designed to be more focused on like a specific instance of, how it works.
So I understand that Baki and Nuket are carrying on this conversation shortly.
Not me, but Nuket will be participating in a panel at UC Davis that is also on Zoom. And she is a participant with somebody who focuses on East Asia and another person who focuses on Europe. And my colleague in medieval and early modern studies organized that. And at the time he was organizing it, he didn't let me know. So as we ended up organizing this on the same day as that. It wasn't intended, but I'm going to be there. Yes, I will be there as a listener. She will be the main participant.
Excellent. What is a follow-up? If we
Send
need
me the
the
link.
I sent the link via chat. If you look at
you're linking us to
sort
the
of like a little bit further up, you will see a link there. If you click on that link, there's a link for registration. If you click on the registration link, you will automatically get a personalized link to watch it.
Okay. All right.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So when are you going to come visit us again, Nuket?
Inshallah, soon, when the pandemic ends, whenever that will happen. Yeah.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. We're all, yeah.
All righty. I'm done. Everybody else done?
Yeah. But I'll see you at Glow, I guess, on the 20th, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Inshallah.
Yeah.
It's quite the Ottoman week.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Çok teşekkür ederim.
Teşekkür ederim.
Estağfurullah. Ben teşekkür ederim. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.